Welcome back. Okay, so we're talking about kinship. Kinship is not just about family, not just about blood relationships, but it's also about relationships outside of family and outside of marriage. So, for the exercise, I wanted you to take a look and think about different types of kinships that we might have with people outside of our immediate family. How does that look? Well, there's actually quite a few ways that we can have kinship outside of the family. Certainly within certain friendships, if I consider my own experience as a means of experience, some of my best friends are considered family, and their families are considered to be my family as well. I treat them as I would any other family member. So my best friend, who I've known for over 30 years now, his parents are my parents, right? I would treat them the same way. So that's one way of doing it, is looking at how friendships and those close familiar relationships, how you might be an aunt or an uncle to one of your friend's kids, because you have that relationship with that child and you take on those responsibilities. We have this in some cases within even like our own Christian sort of cultural background with positions like godparents. Godparents can sometimes be kept within the family, so a brother or sister might take over that responsibility. But also sometimes outside of that, you might choose a close family friend or somebody that you find would be responsible enough to take care of your child. So that can also be an expression of kinship. So a lot of times kinship is sort of an extension of family, of close ties, of shared experience. I think a good example to be used for having kinship outside of the family would be military service. So, and this isn't always the case, but in some cases, you will find that your brothers and sisters in arms, you end up sharing a lot of similar experiences. You train in a similar way. You engage in all the same sort of hierarchical patterns. You have to suffer the same way as everybody else. And by having those shared experiences, and by oftentimes living in close quarters with those folks, you end up creating bonds that are nearly as unbreakable as your family bonds. And that's where shared experience and having a shared history can create that sense of kinship as well. So a lot of times these are your chosen families, right? You have that blood family and then you have that chosen family. And in some cases, those chosen families can be stronger than the blood relationships. It's one of those situations where, let's say you grew up in a rough family, right? Or you might not have much of a family, or any number of reasons. But your close friendships, your ties to these outsiders, your friends and other communities, might become stronger than your relationships with your blood relatives. So again, kinship, as I talked about it in the beginning of the lectures, is by far one of the most difficult things to break. They have a lot more sway and control over behavior than, say, does your religion or other social networks that you might be involved in. If we talk about some of those social networks that we can bring up, some of the examples that you might consider that create kinship. I would say one of the more interesting ones that I've seen revolves around gamers, and how because of this shared experience between people that are playing these games, and because they become way more interactive than the video games of old, so they're online, and you create these dynamics that a lot of the people that you might meet on there, even if you've never actually met them face to face, but they might be a part of your clan, or they might be a part of some group that you have, that there are certain ties that you create. And how we develop those, especially in these, in this case, an artificial environment, right? It's still an environment, even though it's digitally created. So I think it's fascinating to take a look at how people behave towards one another in these virtual realms. So there's that. There's sports. If you belong to a team and you're close knit, or you're part of a social community, so like the Scouts, or if you're there's any number, even workplace communities and workplace kinship. You might work in the same place for many, many years, which isn't necessarily the case for most of us in this age. But if we look back at oftentimes our parents, who might have had the same job for 20, 30, 40 years, they are going to be creating kinships with their coworkers, especially if it's a good working environment. So there are different ways of creating these really close-knit communities outside of your traditional or biological concept of kinship. And these folks can be found in many different places, but they create strong ties that, even though it might be through an activity such as sports or the military or gaming, it does allow you to create those relationships that can only be developed through a shared history, a shared experience, and through that bonding. We talked a little bit earlier about how the nuclear family is changing, and this really is kind of important to understand about American culture. As we look at how our families have sort of separated, and a lot of it depends on opportunity. So we have a tendency to follow wherever opportunity takes us. Our older generations, they're going to be located in a place where they've had a job or they've settled, and all of a sudden we're like, man, I really want to go to California and become like a tech wizard. And that's what I'm going to do. So you go to school, and that's another big thing is, you can go to all kinds of different schools around the country based on whatever it is that you want to study, which is so dynamic, right? There's so many different things that you can learn, but they're not all taught at the same place. So you might have to go somewhere else to follow your interest, follow your passion. So we end up finding that it's more easier now than ever to be able to travel around the world and to travel around the country, to move to a new location and to set up, and then to meet people and start families, but do it on a very small scale, right? We don't have that large-scale family presence as much anymore as we used to. And this is actually sort of changing in a way right now. And especially in a pandemic era, this is going to change sort of dramatically. So environmental factors can impact this as well, but we'll talk about that in a sec. Traditionally, it was more about people would live with their families sometimes their entire lives. And you would have these family units, these family domiciles that might have 3 or 4 generations living in the same building. You might have 15 or 20 people living together with shared responsibilities, shared pooling of resources, and dealing with all the issues. And if we look at sort of these other kinship expressions that we looked at before, the Crow and the Iroquois, and for the most part everyone else, they all live in these shared communities, right? These larger family units than what we have now. It's fairly uncommon in American culture today to see multiple generations living in the same household, or to have multiple siblings living in the same place, especially if they're older siblings. And that has changed a bit, especially when economic times are tough, and we're certainly experiencing some of that now. But for the most part, we break off into these smaller units and travel throughout the country, and and set up shop wherever we end up setting up shop. So, and this is changed as opportunities have changed. This changes when globalization becomes more accessible, and education becomes more accessible, and jobs become more accessible. Transportation is more accessible. Everyone owns a car. And if everybody owns a car, then they can travel more than just throughout their local community or throughout the city if there's public transportation. They can pack up their car and move to another city or another state fairly easily. And because we have this massive unifying language that we all relate to, moving across the country, moving 1,000 miles away, does not mean that you will have a difficult time setting up, because you already know the language, you already know the general norms and values of that community, because they're going to fairly well match your own. So because of this globalization, we've changed how we approach families. And the question that I'm asking you is, what do you think those changes are? And what do you think those changes could benefit? And then what could be some detractors from those, from some of those issues as moving across the country? So think about that. I'm not going to ask you to put that on the discussion, but I want you to think about that as a question. What might be some of the benefits to all of that? So, and this is, we have a different term for this. Is when we talk about families that are moving, we find we are moving away from families of orientation, and that's that multi-generational ideological approach to a family, to families of procreation. And that's where we might leave your nuclear family, or you might meet a mate and then move to a new location, separating yourself from your larger family, from your parents or your siblings. And so this is a fairly popular way that Americans move about the country and move about their daily lives. Hi, Mr. Bear. How's it going, buddy? So here's the next exercise. So 30% of Americans between the age of 18 and 34 are either still living at home or have returned home at some point in time, possibly for multiple years within that time span. Why? Why do you think this is the case? Now, I bet most of you have got a pretty good idea about why, but I would like to have you guys take a few minutes to answer this question. And I'll put this on the discussion board and have you look and contemplate why this is the case. If we've got 30% of adults that are moving back home, why would they do that? Okay, we'll go ahead and stop this section right here, and then we'll move on to the next. We'll see you in a few minutes.